become fashionable nowadays to be tolerant with all kinds of things. We think of the modern person as one who is able to simply either ignore or pretend that a moral problem exists or does not exist. If you object to what you find to be sinful, or what the Bible defines as sinful, you are often regarded or relegated to be some kind of a relic from the past, unable to appreciate the modern changes. And this is exactly the dilemma that many believers are in, or the Christians in the modern age are in. It seems that morality is changing rapidly, and it's so fluid that certain societies embrace the very things that the same society in the last 20 or 30 years would have, frowned upon. But nowadays it has become acceptable, and no one seems to be sounding the alarm. Everybody is just content in saying, oh, maybe that's how things are now. What we will see here is Jesus himself saying, no, that's not how things should be. Instead, this is what would be the consequence of those who say that that's how things will always be. Now let me go back to the story, and would like for you to point out to you that a similar kind of attitude that Jesus would have towards the defilement that he noticed in the temple, and the kind of zeal that he displayed is probably should be our sort of our model in terms of responding to what is going on, not only in our society but in our own spiritual condition as well. So in verse 13, we are told that Jesus would make this journey. In the Gospel of John, he would do this a couple of times to attend Passover. In the other three Gospels, he would only do it once. So there is a bit of a discussion as to how we're going to place this temple cleansing incident. But for our purposes tonight, I would like us to focus on what this incident actually means for Jesus and for each one of us. Verse 13 tells us that it was almost Passover. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We know that the temple is in Jerusalem, and Passover is one of those, if not the most important, Jewish festivals out of the three major festivals that they have. The Passover is a reminder. It's a commemoration of that dramatic deliverance that the Jews experienced during the Exodus. If you recall the story in chapter 12 of Exodus in particular, on the night they were to leave Egypt. This is after a series of plagues, after a series of pleadings of Moses before the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh finally agreed after this particular incident that's being commemorated, the Passover. On that night, they were told that they are to put blood on the doorpost of their houses. And if they do that, the angel will simply pass over those homes that have been marked with the blood, and the firstborn child will not be killed. But of course, this was something that the Jews did on that night since they were instructed. And the angel of death visited Egypt on that night and killed many, if not all, of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. That's sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. So that the following morning, the Pharaoh said, "You can now go." And the Jews are to commemorate this every year. They are to remind themselves that they are what they are. They are enjoying what they have because of that decisive moment in history when God intervened on their behalf. So this was something that everybody would look forward to. Jesus would go to Jerusalem, we are told. And then when he arrived at the scene, in verse 14, we are told, in the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. There are two words that are translated temple in the New Testament. In this case, the first word that is translated as temple here is a reference to the general temple or the complex itself. But in particular, it's referring to the surrounding quarters that surrounds the temple, which is sometimes known as the Gentile courts. This is the area up to which the Gentiles can actually participate in the worship. Beyond that, only male Jews within the temple proper can actually enter. So when he approached this area, he noticed that it was like Christmas, to use a modern equivalent. Business was booming left and right. We are told that there were two different groups of people here mentioned specifically: the sellers of animals and the money changers. Now, before we start saying, what are they doing in the temple, we need to understand that this is actually a support system within the temple worship. Here's what happens. Not all the Jews during that time reside in the Palestine area or in the immediate vicinity of Jerusalem. Because of the dispersion of the Jews on many occasions, we know, many of these Jews live outside of Jerusalem, and they would have to venture at a given time during the year to visit Jerusalem. Because that's the highlight of their religious identity, being in the temple and participating there. So you have Jews from the different parts of the world congregating during this particular time of the year. Now you know what that means, right? You know when the highways leading up to Jerusalem are all backed up. You know when all the camels and the horses and the donkeys in their caravans heading into Jerusalem, you would increase the population of this small city by tenfolds, perhaps. Different estimates are given, but let's just say that it would become so crowded. There will be so many people participating in these festivals, but this particular festival, if you recall, since this is based on that incident in Exodus, would require an animal sacrifice. Perhaps even if you try to bring an animal, you've probably been meticulous in trying to prepare it, but when you get to Jerusalem, if that animal is do not comply with the requirements, it's too sick, perhaps got tired, or it's not pure enough or anything like that, the priest would simply say, because they have, this is a regulation within the temple, so they have, inspectors. And they would look at that animal and check it. It's like, I'm sorry, it's just not acceptable. And you could imagine how frustrating that can be. And where do you go? You have this array of sellers of animals, and they would say, you need a goat? These are pre-approved goats with the certification from the high priest. You want a cow? You want a dove? If you're poor, you can only afford a dove. Then they have all that ready. So they're doing some help, for the pilgrims in particular. The money changers are also part of the system. Because if you're traveling from abroad, most likely you're carrying foreign currency. And the foreign coins during that time usually have the image of an emperor or some individuals that the Jews definitely would not want to see. So that foreign currencies are not acceptable at all at the temple. And you're required to pay a temple tax, which is half a shekel. So you would have to bring your foreign currency before a money changer, and they would change it for the legit Jerusalem currency, which is a Tyrian coin, as we know in history, so that you can use that as an offering in the temple. So it's not that bad if you think about it, because all these businesses were set up to provide support to the worshipers. But as we all know, whenever religion is commercialized, whenever religion is used for profiteering, whenever pilgrims and travelers are involved, whenever individuals are placed in a situation where they have very limited options in the case of not having enough the right animals or enough money to be used in the temple, there are always individuals who will take advantage. Now, we know that there was a lot of profiteering involved in the temple worship. We know this because from history, especially from the writings of a man named Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote a lot about what we call Second Temple Judaism. Even in one of those revolts, so we know that there was a list of debts that was hidden in the temple that were first destroyed, because they were thought to have been, that people were actually exploited into getting into debt, and they are unable to pay, and their lands and houses were sequestered as a result. So there is that particular notoriety, if you may, that many of these religious folks were at times would take advantage of these festivals. But Jesus is one who would say, that cannot be. That's not how God intended this whole thing to be. God's regulations when it comes to sacrifice, God's protocols when it comes to worship and all that, they were not meant to burden people. They were meant to understand that there is a holy and a pure God who demands nothing less. But in the hands of scrupulous individuals, they were able to turn profit out of the very good things that God Himself has given His people. You see, the temple is personally associated with God. That is why God gave explicit instructions to David and then to Solomon in terms of how it is to be built. This was not just a monument, but this was reflective of the glory of God. During this time, this is what we have, what we know as the Herod's temple. Herod beautified the temple. At first, the Jews were suspicious in terms of what he's going to do, but he employed and spent a lot of money to beautify this place. It was wonderful. But inside the temple itself, and what has become of the attitude of the people who participate and even manage the temple, something has completely gone wrong. Now, you see, because God is holy and pure, He will not tolerate such a defilement. God is not going to, just going to stand by and say, it's okay, I understand what's going on. He's going to call out the people for that, for what a worship has become at this time, which we may say to be that of a cheap worship. So God's judgment is inevitable in a situation like this. I know at times we think of the compromises that we engage in as something that would have very negligible consequences. We foolishly assume somehow that because in terms of its magnitude and in terms of its duration and the people who are affected, maybe it would not really turn out into something really big and that would bother you for life. But I'm sure you know of a time when you have been just completely mistaken. Right? You probably accepted something that you should not accept. You probably allowed yourself to get involved that you think is morally questionable. You have allowed for your friends and family to influence you, to take a direction that you know is really far from God's will for your life. And yet you're considering that and you're thinking, well, it's not really that bad. It's just a slight deviation. It's not really a contradiction in any way. And then we would find ourselves reaping the consequence. I could imagine that maybe this whole situation at the temple really started with some brilliant idea. Some individual said, why don't we help our countrymen? They're visiting the temple. Let's assist and provide for them. It was a great idea. And then you have this whole mess before you. So this is sort of a fair warning to each one of us also, that we may not be able to discern the subtle shift in our life. We may not be able to discern that suddenly our love for God is being displaced by a love for money, for example. That the very things that we said we would do for the sake of God would turn out to be in itself a substitute for God. Jesus said, you have exploited worship. You have turned it into a profiteering exercise. Instead of worship being directed towards God, instead of helping people focus on God, they actually help themselves to profit from the worship of others. In verse 15, so he made a whip out of cords, probably some fiber that he put together. Because you have animals, of course, and so this is probably used to tie up some animals. He probably gathered these ropes or fibers, whatever, and he formed it into a cord. And he began driving from the temple courts both sheep and cattle. So this is Jesus, probably tying his tunic like that and grabbing a rope, a cord, and just start hitting those animals. And then he scattered the coin of the money changers. As you could imagine, the money changers have tables with them to do the exchange and the weighing and all that. Jesus overturned those. And then to the dove sellers, he simply spoke to them. Some suggested that Jesus was kind with the dove sellers, since they're the ones, doves are the one used by the poorest of the Jews as a sacrifice. I don't know if that's really intended here. But the point is, the same rebuke is going to be directed not only to the dove sellers, but to everybody involved in this whole scheme. Jesus said, stop turning my Father's house into a market. Stop turning my temple into a shopping mall. What has become of the temple then is that from something that is sacred, now it has become common. From something that's special, now it has become not so special anymore, since the activity for which it was reserved for, or the purpose for which it was created, has been expanded in this case to include everything else, include commerce, selling and buying of goods. Jesus said, he's protesting against these profiteering activities. He's calling it a desecration of the sacred space. You see, the idea of holiness in the scriptures is about separating something for an exclusive use or for an exclusive purpose. Individuals are regarded to be holy, in the case of the priest, for example, because they are dedicated unto God. A place can be considered holy because it's solely used for praising or for gathering in order to praise and honor God. But Jesus is now saying, you have changed, you have manipulated, and used this place for purposes other than what it was originally intended for. So what Jesus has done here is to act out a prophetic gesture. Is in a way expressing the fact that this place is now being condemned. It's no longer functioning as it should be. It has become not a temple anymore. It's no longer a place where people from all nations would come and worship. It has become a stock market, a stockyard, where people from all places would come and buy animals. Now, what Jesus is doing here is dangerous business, by the way. Anti-temple polemic and anti-temple actions are often met with violent response. You don't speak against the temple and you do not act in order to desecrate the temple, which is quite ironic here if you look at the situation. Well, maybe the Jews of the day would say, oh, we're not really talking about the temple proper. This is just the outer courts, right? But generally, it's the whole temple complex. So maybe they're saying that, that's why we don't really let them into the main sanctuary, because it's bad. but they're allowed on the Gentile courts, which is, by the way, a form of discrimination also. Because now they're saying it's okay for the Gentiles to worship with the animals, but as for us, male Jews, it's got to be something else. But Jesus said, no. Everything about this thing is simply wrong. Now, some commentators suggested that maybe what Jesus did here is not so much a violent expression of his anger. I mean, there is obviously intensity. I mean, this whole scenario is quite intense. If you look at what Jesus is doing, he's physically removing or causing the removal of people and animals in the area. He probably did not hit somebody or hurt somebody, except for the animals, I suppose. But this is not uncontrolled anger. This is not an individual who went berserk, right? But in fact, this is what Jesus would say about this whole thing. He says, in verse 17, as the disciples understood the whole scenario, they said, his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. This was the natural outflow of Jesus' passion for the temple or for God himself. This is genuine spiritual zeal. This is reminiscent of what Zechariah said in chapter 14 when he prophesied that there will be a time in the future when the temple will be completely be rid of merchants. Malachi also expressed a desire that on the last day, God will come suddenly into the temple and restore true and proper worship. So it is along that prophetic, belief and expectation that somebody will come and replace, or if not, restore the temple, because what has become of the temple is no longer acceptable to God. So this must have caused, some kind of a commotion in the crowd, which resulted obviously in a query from the religious leaders. The Jews responded to him in verse 18, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" You see, as I have said, this is a prophetic gesture. He's assuming the role of a prophet, which obviously he is. And now he's acting out, God's condemnation on the temple by what he is doing. The disciples understood it to be a prophetic act. But the people just couldn't get it. They said, "Why are you doing this? Can you show us a proof that you are in fact authorized to kick these people out of the temple?" Jesus answered, which is very mysterious, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. You will see two different responses to this declaration. In verse 20, they replied, that is the Jews, "It has taken 4 to 6 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" They're pointing out the impossibility of a structure like this to be destroyed instantly and to be rebuilt in 3 days. It's impossible indeed. But then the disciples took it differently. Of course, this is the result of further reflection. You remember the Gospels were written after Jesus has already ascended into heaven. This is after many believers have reflected, have looked at the Old Testament and understood everything else that took place. From the time Jesus came into the scene, up to the time that he died, he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. As a further reflection, they said in verse 21, the gospel writer points out to us that the temple that Jesus was speaking of was his body. Of course, the Jews did not get that. In their persistent unbelief, they never understood what it was. But for the believers, for the disciples, they remembered this particular instance after Jesus was resurrected. Now, there is sort of an inner meaning in these declarations here, which you probably are not able to discern on the surface. But we know that Jesus, when he talks about his body, in this case it stands for what he would suffer, his crucifixion, and also his resurrection. So we know that the allusion to 3 days is also a reference to the being dead for 3 days and then being resurrected on the third day. So what Jesus is doing here is sort of employing what we call a double entendre or a double meaning. On the one hand, he's referring to the physical temple as it is. He's saying that it's going to be destroyed. In fact, we know that in AD 70, when the Romans came, they leveled the whole thing. So maybe it's a prophetic claim that this temple will eventually be destroyed because it has become a sacrilegious place. But also there is an inner meaning. He said, it's actually my body. It will be destroyed in the sense that he would die, but it will be raised again on the third day. So the next question is, in what sense is Jesus' body the temple? We know that in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus himself is God's presence here on earth. And in his resurrection, crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus, as if, in a theological sense, has become the new temple in which God's presence resides, and his people are able to commune with the presence of God in Jesus. But Jesus is simply proclaiming that he has become the new temple here. But at this point, Jesus is saying that for those who are identified with him, those who trusted in him, they do not need to go to Jerusalem to worship God. They can worship Jesus. So what Jesus essentially is doing here is not only condemning, in a negative sense, condemning what has become of the temple, but in a positive sense, he also wants us to emulate his extreme desire to protect the honor and the glory of God. Now, of course, there's no temple for each one of us here to protect, but we can probably say that there are a lot of things that God has done and has given in our life that we ought to be dedicating for God's honor and for God's glory. Our very own life. If we are not using it for God's glory, if we are not utilizing our breath to praise and honor God, if we are not using our talent to bring glory to God, we are in effect not functioning in accordance with the intentions that God has for us. He has called us to be his people. He has called us to be his ambassadors. He has called us to be salt and light in this world. There are many things that, labels in the Bibles that are attached to people who follow Jesus. But a lot of times we hear of believers and even Christians nowadays being called out. Why? Because they do not act in accordance with the claims that they are making about themselves.